She slipped into my bed without a word, smiled boldly, and held me tight. It had been a long day, and the weight of the world seemed to press down harder with each step the protagonist took toward home. The streets outside were filled with the usual noise, car engines roaring, people chatting as they made their way to their destinations, and the occasional honk of a horn. But inside, everything was quiet. There was a peaceful calm in the house, a contrast to the chaos of the outside world. The protagonist, exhausted from work and all that life had thrown at them recently, didn't have the energy to do much except take a shower and climb into bed. As they pulled back the covers, ready to let the day slip away into the quiet of the night, something felt different. It wasn't just the weariness or the routine of another evening alone. There was a strange sense that something, or someone, was about to change everything. The protagonist sank into the softness of the bed, letting the coolness of the sheets surround them, and just as their minds started to wander into sleep, they felt a presence beside them. For a moment, there was no sound, no words spoken, just the soft rustle of movement. The protagonist felt the bed shift as if someone had gently settled beside them. Their heart began to race, not from fear, but from a rush of confusion and recognition. They turned slightly, eyes adjusting to the low light in the room, and saw a figure there beside them. Without a word, the person smiled, a smile that held warmth, confidence, and something else, something the protagonist couldn't quite place. It was as if they were seeing an old friend, someone who had been a part of their life for a long time. The smile wasn't awkward or uncertain. It was bold, like it had always belonged there. No words were exchanged, but in that moment, everything was understood. The protagonist wasn't sure how to react, unsure whether to embrace or question the situation. But somehow they knew it wasn't a moment for questions. It was a moment that called for simply being present, just being together. Without any hesitation, the person beside them moved closer, gently curling their arm around the protagonist. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a natural one that spoke volumes without the need for explanation. The protagonist's body tensed for a second, a reflex to the unexpected touch, but it quickly melted away. The warmth of the embrace felt like home, as if this was the place they were always meant to be. No words were needed, as the gesture of holding each other said more than any conversation could. As the minutes passed, they just lay there in silence, savoring the feeling of being close to another human being. The protagonist's mind began to wander, drifting between the past and present. They hadn't seen this person in what felt like years, but the connection between them was undeniable. Memories of shared moments flooded their thoughts, time spent laughing, comforting each other during difficult times, and the deep conversations that stretched late into the night. It was these moments that formed the bond between them, a bond that had not been broken by time or distance. But life had a way of pulling people in different directions. Jobs, commitments, and personal journeys often caused friendships to fade, and that's what had happened here. Though the bond had remained in the back of their minds, it had been so long since they had been this close to each other. The protagonist couldn't help but wonder what had brought the other person back. Was this just a coincidence? A random visit? Or was there more to it than that? The thoughts swirled in their mind, but for now, there was no need to worry. Tonight, there were no questions, just the simple presence of someone who had always meant something to them. The protagonist let out a quiet sigh, realizing how much they had missed this. They had spent so many nights alone, not by choice, but because life had taken them down a different path. But tonight was different. Tonight, they had someone beside them, someone who understood them in a way few others did. They could feel the gentle rise and fall of the other person's chest, matching their own steady breathing, and it grounded them in a way they hadn't felt in a long time. As the minutes stretched into hours, there was no pressure to talk or to fill the silence with anything other than the comfort of shared space. The world outside seemed to fade away, and in that small, quiet room, everything felt perfect. The protagonist had never been one to crave attention or seek validation from others, But the feeling of being wanted, of being held without question, was something they had longed for without even realizing it. It wasn't about romance or grand gestures. It was about connection, about being seen and understood in a way that made all the struggles and hardships of life seem a little easier to bear. But even in this peaceful moment, doubts lingered. The protagonist had lived so long with the idea of being independent, of standing on their own 2 feet, that they weren't sure if they were ready to open up again. Could they trust this person with their heart? Or would the distance between them grow once more? Life had a way of complicating things. And as much as the protagonist wanted to believe that things could return to the way they once were, they couldn't ignore the reality that time had changed them both. The world had changed, and so had they. Still, as the night wore on, the protagonist found comfort in the quiet presence beside them. There were no demands, no expectations. Just 2 people sharing a space, both uncertain about the future, but willing to be there for one another in the present. They didn't need to talk about everything, didn't need to lay out their lives in front of each other. It was enough to simply be here, together, for a brief moment of peace in a chaotic world. When the first light of morning crept through the curtains, the stillness of the room was only broken by the soft sound of the other person shifting beside them. The protagonist felt their heartbeat quicken for a moment, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that the night was coming to an end. The warmth that had filled the room, the comfort of the shared silence, was beginning to dissipate. Soon the person beside them would have to leave, and the protagonist would be left to face the day alone once again. But for now, they didn't move. They simply lay there, eyes closed, savoring the moment. The world outside was starting to wake up, but in this small, quiet space, they felt like they were suspended in time. The weight of the day hadn't arrived yet, and for a brief moment, they didn't have to think about anything. They didn't have to worry about what came next. All that mattered was the simple act of being held, of sharing this moment with someone who understood, without needing to say a word. The silence that had settled in the room felt like a blanket, warm and protective. The protagonist couldn't help but lose themselves in the comfort of it. The familiar presence of the person beside them was a soothing balm for all the worries and stress they had been carrying. The world outside seemed so far away, as though it had no power to reach them in this small space. For the first time in a long time, they felt completely at ease. But as the minutes turned into hours, the thoughts that had been lingering in the back of the protagonist's mind started to surface again. There was the nagging question that had followed them throughout the night. Why are they here now? It was a question they had tried to push aside, but it kept returning, demanding an answer. The protagonist had been content with the silence, but now the weight of uncertainty felt heavy. The other person, sensing the shift in energy, shifted slightly, as if they could feel the growing tension. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was there, hanging between them like an invisible thread. The protagonist turned their heads slightly, catching a glimpse of the other person's face in the soft light of the morning. They looked peaceful, calm, yet there was something in their eyes, an unspoken understanding that made the protagonist wonder if they had been through their own battles, their own struggles. The protagonist's mind drifted back to the years that had passed since they had last been this close. Time had a way of pulling people apart, even when the bond was strong. It wasn't that they had grown apart out of choice, but life had a way of making things complicated. People change, circumstances shift, and suddenly, what was once easy and familiar becomes distant and unknown. But tonight, this unexpected reunion had felt like a reminder of something important. What had they been so afraid of? The past was full of memories, both sweet and painful, but they couldn't change it. All they could do was accept it, learn from it, and move forward. Maybe this was the first step. Maybe this was the chance to rediscover something they had lost along the way. It wasn't easy, though. The protagonist had built walls around themselves, walls that had kept others out for a long time. It wasn't because they didn't want connection, but because it had always felt safer to keep people at a distance, letting someone back in, letting someone see all the parts of them they had tried to hide. It was terrifying. And yet, here they were, letting someone in again. even if it was just for a moment. The person beside them seemed to sense this, as if they knew the protagonist's hesitation, the fear of opening up. Slowly, they shifted even closer, their arms still around the protagonist, but now the touch was gentler, more reassuring. There were no demands, no expectations, just the simple act of being there. It wasn't about fixing anything or making grand declarations. It was just about being together in this small moment, letting the quiet speak for itself. The protagonist felt their breath slow down, the tension in their chest easing little by little. This was not a moment to question, not a moment to overthink. It was just a moment to be present. And for once, the protagonist allowed themselves to just be. Time seemed to stretch in those few minutes, and the protagonist felt as though they were suspended in a world where nothing else mattered. No responsibilities, no worries, just the quiet comfort of being held by someone who understood. In that moment, the protagonist realized how much they had missed this, how much they had missed the feeling of being seen, of being cared for, without any strings attached. For so long, they had been caught up in the busyness of life, in the endless cycle of work, obligations, and the need to constantly keep moving. But this was different. This moment of stillness, of connection, was something the protagonist hadn't realized they needed until it was right there in front of them. They didn't need to speak to share their feelings. The quiet was enough. The way the person beside them gently tightened their embrace, the way they offered a comforting presence without needing to fill the space with words. It was enough. In that silence, the protagonist felt something begin to shift within them. Maybe they had been afraid to open up before, but tonight, they could feel the walls slowly starting to crumble. As the night slowly faded into the early hours of the morning, the protagonist realized that sometimes there didn't need to be an explanation for everything. Sometimes the most important moments in life were the ones that didn't require words. It was the simple things, the quiet touches, the shared moments of peace that made life feel less heavy. And in that moment, with the soft glow of dawn just beginning to creep through the curtains, the protagonist knew that this night would stay with them. It wasn't the start of a new chapter or the end of an old one. It was simply a moment, a fleeting, beautiful moment of connection. And for now, that was enough. The light of the morning slowly began to fill the room, casting a gentle glow over everything. The protagonist could feel the warmth of the sun filtering through the curtains, but it wasn't quite enough to break the stillness that had settled between them. The person beside them hadn't moved, still holding them close, and for a moment, the protagonist just lay there, not wanting to disturb the peace that hung in the air. But as the minutes passed, the world outside began to call. The hum of the city grew louder, the sounds of life creeping back into their space. The protagonist felt the familiar pull of responsibility, the weight of the day ahead. They knew they couldn't stay here forever, wrapped in the comfort of this quiet moment. The world outside would keep moving, and they would have to face it soon. But for now, they allowed themselves to savor the stillness. The person beside them shifted slightly, their breathing steady, their presence a constant source of comfort. The protagonist didn't want to move, but they could feel the inevitable shift coming, the moment when everything would change, when they would have to face the reality of the situation. It wasn't that they wanted to leave this space, but the world outside was waiting for them, just as it always did. But even as that realization settled in, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for this moment. It had been so long since they had felt this way, so long since they had allowed themselves to be vulnerable, to let someone in. And though they didn't know what would come next, they couldn't ignore the fact that something inside them had changed. Something had shifted, and they didn't know exactly what it was. But they knew it was important. As they slowly sat up, careful not to disturb the other person, they felt a sense of clarity wash over them. The world was still there, waiting for them to face it. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel so alone. They had reconnected with something deep within themselves, a part of them that had been buried for a long time, buried under the weight of expectations, responsibilities, and fears. The person beside them stirred, their eyes slowly opening, and the protagonist met their gaze. There was no need for words. In that simple moment of eye contact, everything was understood. They didn't need to say anything to explain how they felt. It was already clear. The connection they shared, though quiet and unspoken, was stronger than any words could convey. The protagonist stood up, stretching, and as they moved toward the window, they couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The day had begun and life was calling, but for a brief moment they allowed themselves to simply be. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they weren't the same person they had been before. They had learned to be present, to appreciate the small moments, to allow themselves to feel, even when it was difficult. And as the person beside them slowly got up, joining them by the window, the protagonist realized that maybe this was all they needed right now, to simply be here, in this moment, with someone who understood. The rest of the world could wait. As the sun rose higher, spilling more light into the room, the world outside started to wake up. The sounds of the city were faint but present. People were going about their day, each one with their own responsibilities, tasks, and goals. Yet, for a brief moment, it felt like time had slowed down for the protagonist. The room, still filled with the warmth from the previous night, felt like a safe cocoon. The sense of peace lingered, even as the protagonist's thoughts turned to the day ahead. The person beside them sat up slowly, their bodies stretching with a gentle yawn. They didn't say anything at first. The quiet that filled the room seemed just as comfortable as the embrace they had shared the night before. No words were needed to fill the space. It was the kind of silence that felt natural, where both people could be present without the pressure to speak. For a moment, the protagonist simply watched them, not out of curiosity, but because the other person seemed so at ease, so comfortable in this shared moment. The simplicity of it all struck them. It was a rare thing to be able to share a space with someone and not feel the need to fill every second with conversation. It was a relief, honestly. They had spent so much of their life rushing from one thing to the next, always thinking about the future or stressing over the past, that they had forgotten how to just be in the moment. The person beside them finally spoke, their voice soft but steady. "Do you think we're different now?" The question caught the protagonist by surprise. It wasn't that they hadn't thought about it, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. They had changed. That much was certain. It wasn't just about the person beside them or the quiet embrace they had shared. It was about something deeper, something that had been stirring within the protagonist for a long time. The protagonist nodded slowly, as if confirming their own thoughts. "I think we both are," they said, the words feeling heavier than they had expected. "Life changes us, doesn't it?"
The other person gave a small smile, their eyes reflecting a quiet understanding.
"Yeah, it does. But it's not always a bad thing, is it?"
"No, it's not," the protagonist answered. "Sometimes change is just growth."
It's necessary even if it feels hard at times. For a while they sat there, side by side, not needing to say anything more.
There was no urgency to rush into the day. It was as if time had granted them this small pocket of peace, to sit with their thoughts, to reflect on where they had been and where they might be going. Eventually, the other person stood up, moving toward the door. Their movements were slow, but there was a kind of grace in them. The protagonist followed their lead, slowly standing as well. It wasn't as if they didn't want to stay in the moment. It was just that they both knew the world outside was waiting for them. They couldn't stay here forever. The person paused at the door, turning back to face the protagonist. "I guess we have to get on with it, don't we?" The protagonist smiled, feeling a bit lighter. "Yeah, but it's okay. We don't have to figure everything out all at once. Not today, anyway." The person nodded, offering a simple smile that said more than any words could. And just like that, the tension from earlier seemed to melt away. There was no pressure to have all the answers. They didn't need to know what came next. They just had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. "Take care of yourself," the other person said softly, their voice gentle but firm. I will, the protagonist replied, watching them leave. As the door clicked shut behind them, the protagonist stood there for a moment, feeling an odd mixture of emotions. It was as if the night they had shared had opened up something inside them, something they had pushed aside for too long. The weight that had been there for so long didn't seem so heavy anymore. Maybe it was because they had shared it. Or maybe it was because they had finally let themselves feel again. The protagonist moved toward the window, looking out at the city below. It was waking up, just like them. The world felt bigger now, but also a little more manageable. The worries that had seemed so pressing before felt smaller, less intimidating. Maybe it was the quiet of the night that had helped them find perspective. Or maybe it was the connection they had shared with someone who understood them without needing to ask. For the first time in a long time, the protagonist felt a sense of peace that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. It was theirs. They could feel it in the deep breath they took, in the way their shoulders felt less tense. They didn't have all the answers, but they didn't need them right now. Life would continue, and they would continue with it. But they had learned something important. It was okay to be vulnerable, to let others in, and to take things one moment at a time. The protagonist took a few more minutes, standing by the window, watching the world move on around them. It was a new day, and though there was still so much ahead, they felt ready, not because everything had suddenly fallen into place, but because they had learned to accept the unknown, to embrace the silence, and to trust that everything would unfold as it was meant to. With a final deep breath, they turned away from the window and moved toward their day. There was no rush. The world could wait just a little longer. Today, they had time. Time to reflect, to grow, and to move forward, knowing that they were no longer alone in the way they had been before. As they stepped into the day, the protagonist held on to the feeling that had stayed with them from the night before. It was a quiet strength, a reminder that life had its ups and downs, but in the end, it was all part of the journey. And no matter what came next, they knew they had the ability to face it. Today, tomorrow, and the days to come, everything would unfold just as it always did. But now they would face it with a little more peace, a little more understanding, and a lot more hope.